Hello and welcome to the Leadership Lab, the podcast where we dissect life science success stories. I'm your host, Maurice, and I'm thrilled to bring you conversations with industry visionaries in the life science space who will discuss their successes, failures, challenges, and also the leaders who inspired them. Welcome to the Leadership Lab. I'm your host, Maurice Thornton, and I am very excited and honored to have today in the studio with me, Sarah Holmes-Klotz. She is the Chief Human Resources Officer of Pharmaceuticals, based just outside of Basel. Welcome. Very happy to have you here today.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me, Maurice.
So look, we're going to get into everything as we usually try to do. And I know, but I'm sure some of us can already tell from your accent that you're not from here. So where you actually come from?
I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts, in the U.S.
So Boston, like
Boston,
city
Boston.
But we all know kind of Southie and Cambridge. And was there a particular neighborhood that people would recognize?
Well, I was born in Boston proper, grew up in the suburbs, but then went to college and lived in Back Bay. So Back Bay.
No idea. Okay. I mean, I've never been to Boston, but I've been East Coast U.S. quite a bit. So you went to primary school in Back Bay, or you were in Boston at that time?
I was primary school up through high school in the suburbs. So I was a suburban girl, although I was born in the city, and then went to BU in Boston and lived in Back Bay. Even during my studies, I actually lived in Back Bay, South End, through my studies and then through my 20s.
Okay. And what were you like as a kid? You know, like a little kid. Did you always want to be in HR, or were you?
No, I think I probably would have not wanted to be in HR. I think I didn't really know what HR was when I was younger.
Me neither.
But I did want to be. I loved newscasters. I always thought were very interesting. So there was a Liz, I forgot her last name, Liz Walker, Channel 4 in Boston was my kind of an idol.
That was your hero.
Yeah, she was.
So you watched the news when you were a kid?
Absolutely.
Like regularly?
Yeah. Regularly.
Just to see Liz?
To see her, but also to stay up current with news. It was something we did as a family after dinner.
Oh, really? Okay. And so family, you had brothers, sisters, and parents, everybody around. What did your parents do, if I could ask?
Sure. So my mom was a nurse and my dad was a high school teacher.
Okay. So it's always funny when people have, when we have teacher and nurse, very service of the community type of roles, and then you ended up doing something which is also kind of in service, but in a very different or corporate setting. How was it that when you were completing high school and thinking about going off to college, university, what was driving your decision making at that time? Like, what were you looking to do?
I was actually more inclined towards the arts, the fine arts. So I was a combination of, I loved science, did very well in science, but also was very interested in the arts and actually fine arts and architecture. So it was a real challenge to figure out which direction to go into. My science teachers would have actually preferred if I went science, and I had an interest in medicine, but didn't want to spend all the time for a medical degree. Right. So I actually decided to study English and art history and eventually architecture.
Okay, I want to come back to that. But what about extracurriculars when you were younger? Was there anything that you did outside of school, or just, playing, I guess, but team sports, music, anything like that?
A lot. I was really busy outside of school. I have older brothers and a younger sister, so I was always trying to be one of the boys, let's say. Okay. And then very much, climbing trees. I played soccer, but then eventually I actually was very involved. I was a figure skate competitive ice skater, and then I ran track.
So was that around the time of like Tonya Harding? And yeah. So there was drama. Okay, so you were, again, I grew up in Toronto, so Boston, Toronto, we've got a big rivalry anyway in hockey. I'm a hockey player, but similar winters.
Yes.
And so similar sports. What drew you to figure skating?
I think it was the combination of the physicalness of it. You need to be very athletic, and the artistic part. So it was a combination of being the athleticism needed for jumps and spins, and then the creativeness. This was the time of Torvill and Dean as well. So it was really influenced.
Torvill and Dean, I don't know
that. They were ice dancers from the UK. So they were on the artistic front, and then I think her name was Debbie Brown. There was Debbie. She was this famous figure skater out of the U.S. who was also my idol, probably 84 Olympics.
Her and Liz.
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
Yes, exactly.
okay. But figure skating is like, it's funny. I go pretty regularly to the local rink, and I sometimes watch the kids when either my kid's playing hockey or I'm playing hockey, and you have the figure skaters and you see them on before, and it's just repeat, 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 repeat over and over and over and over again. I mean, would that be an accurate description of how you train?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And would you say that there was any application of that into studies or career?
I do. I think it actually is part of my kind of sports journey, which then translated into running, doing marathons, and then actually now do a lot of triathlons and triathletes. And I think it's that you never give up and to keep pushing and just to kind of push yourself and the resiliency. And I've seen that in both my kind of sports career as well as professionally. So bringing that, yeah, absolutely. And I paid the price. I just had a hip surgery that I'm just getting over and hoping to run by the end of the summer. But that's that resiliency that I think sports has taught me over the years.
So I did 3 triathlons like 10 years ago. And then I kind of said, okay, I did it. Don't need to do it again. What do you like about that?
Well, I'm a little bit of a thrill seeker. So it's one of that feeling of I can do it. So I sometimes ask myself, why do I do this? Why do I put in all the hours training? But when I'm at an event, it's just this kind of pushing the limit physically, which I like. So I think that's part of probably, I don't know if it's a thrill seeker, but it's just this ability to push yourself is probably something that's a theme in my life.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thrill part I don't get, because for me, there's nothing more boring than running. Like, I'm going to go run tonight, but because that's what's there. My son, he has hockey. There's a running track right there. No point in going home, so I just run the track. And I have a podcast, and it's okay. You know, that kind of keeps me distracted, but I don't find it to be thrilling. So is it more like improving the time that you find thrilling? Or do you actually find running? Is this like when you're running, you're like, it's very thrilling.
You get to that endorphin level. So it has to be a certain training level. So I can get that with running and biking and swimming. And it's just this, you hit this
runner's
point.
High.
The runner's high, you hear about it. You can get it with biking, the swimming as well. And so it's been nice to find a sport that encapsulates it all. But it's very intense and definitely energy intensive.
Yeah, and do you ever do an Ironman?
I did. So I did. I have done the half Ironman and hope to eventually do it again. When my hip's better. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So that's kind of the progression. It was figure skating. Well, you had soccer, figure skating, and then just running, and then
triathlons. Yeah.
Okay. Jumping back.
Mm-hmm.
So high school, more fine arts.
Mm-hmm.
History, I think you said.
Yeah. Architectural history. Yeah.
Exactly. What's that?
Architectural history is the study of architecture. So I've always enjoyed that. It's just, since I was a kid, I think it's this building things, which I think also now is part of my career, is I used to build houses out of leaves. I'd build a floor plan in my parents' yard. They had an acre. And so I'd build a floor plan with leaves. And I think that's just then I've always enjoyed architecture.
So is this like flying buttresses and like the ancient architecture, or is it like architectural history is the development of architecture over time, or
it's the span of different architects. So you can look at different periods. I happen to grow up in New England, so the preservation of these 16th century, 17th century houses was very popular. So I like old and new. So for me, architectural history was really all of the different eras, but there was a big focus on probably the 17th century in New England, as there was a lot of houses to be preserved at that time.
Okay, so I was going to say, what does one do with that? Is that what one does?
Exactly. That was my first job out of college, was working for an architectural firm that restored houses or also restored some museums, kind of building things, also new components with old. So that was the firm I worked at, specialized in that.
Was this Gannett, Walsh and Cutler?
Not yet. That was Ann Beha Associates. So Ann Beha Associates was my first job. Female-owned company. She's still around. She did the turned a jail in Boston, Suffolk's jail, into a high-end hotel. So, yeah.
Interesting history, I guess.
Yeah.
I can't imagine the suite names. Okay, but to go back, you're finishing school. It's going to be architecture. You start applying around for roles, I guess. I mean,
yeah. So the plan was, to to get a master's in architectural history, then a PhD, and then teach. So my goal was to teach at a college level, university level architectural history. And lo and behold, I found out there were not many full-time positions in the U.S. at all. And I had loans to pay back. And at that time, I was paying back my master's loans by working part-time, actually at Genzyme, which was really the start of my HR career.
Okay. I want to come back to that. But a lot of people that I speak to are usually coming out of university or they're still in, and a lot of them are highly planned, almost too much, in my opinion. Not to offend you, but it didn't sound like you had much of a plan, because if you had studied this thing and you were going to do a PhD and then you realize, oh, there's no jobs kind of halfway through. So it was more follow the passion.
It was. And I was going to say that's probably what I'm not doing with my children who are now, college age and entering college. My parents actually let me follow my desires and I stumbled a lot, and maybe that's not a bad thing.
So how did you stumble?
I think, getting loans for a master's degree and not realizing that there's not a lot of full-time positions is not smart planning. But my parents never said no. They just said, you need to be able to come up with this amount of money for your tuition. We'll support you however we can, but this is on you. And I think that was how I learned. And even just, pivoting. So, deciding, what am I going to do now? I'm going to finish my master's. I knew I needed to at least finish it, and then look for other positions. And also seeing, that position at Genzyme, they even offered me a role, but I said, I'm not sure pharmaceutical will pay those bills. And so I went to financial services instead at that time. Okay.
So you're studying the master's. How'd you get a job at Genzyme?
So a friend of mine had told me about temp work. She said, there's a company, Randstad's doing temp work, sign up. And it was temp work that I think then turned into more of a regular temp job, part-time job as an assistant to an HR business partner at Genzyme in Cambridge.
Okay. So,
yeah.
And for those who don't know, Genzyme's now part of Sanofi, but what that was like an exciting time.
It was.
I don't want to date you. I have no idea when you were there.
Yeah.
But if it was kind of the pre-Sanofi times, what was that like working in
It was
Boston,
exciting.
Startup?
This was, if anyone knows, there's Cambridge Square. This was the heart of Cambridge Square before it became Cambridge Square. Yeah. This was the backside of MIT. They had warehouses, and a Genzyme at that time was really a combination of various buildings that were just warehouses, and they were connected with walkways, or you had to walk outside. But it was really this culture of doing something different with pharmaceuticals. And that boss took me, my first day on the job, took me down to the basement where the mice were, and explained all, the entire pharmaceutical development cycle from, testing in rats or mice to people, and obviously the rare disease. And at the time, I don't know if I really appreciated all of it. It was just, I was taking it all in. Here I was coming from the fine arts world, now suddenly in the business world. But this was really about also culture. So this was in the late 90s, around 1999.
Okay. Yeah, I also got to see the rats, but I got to stay with the rats and do all the research with the rats.
Okay.
I used to be a preclinical researcher.
Okay, yeah, so you know.
So I know. Probably smelled nicer upstairs. Was there a point when you thought, aha, like this is either HR or pharma biotech? Was there a aha moment when you thought, wait, maybe this could be my career?
It wasn't. It was interesting. At the time, I was taking it all in. I was listening to people. I had a great boss at that time who's telling me about culture, talked about people. He talked about, being in the business. And I think I didn't appreciate it that much because at the time I was just thinking, how am I going to pay these loans back? And then when I finished that master's, the Genzyme offered me a role. I think it was in the talent team. This was talent development. Or I was also looking at financial services, and I thought financial services would pay off. So I actually then pivoted. And it wasn't until maybe 2 roles later that I realized HR was actually where I was landing.
And where did you go to work in financial services?
That was Gannett, Welch & Cotler.
Oh, that's what that was. Okay, because I was trying to figure it out when I was looking at your background. And I was like, okay. So what do they do?
So they're in the financial services. What they do is they're They're in financial investments but mostly in municipal bonds. So it's privately held, and it was just a great company to really learn about, investing. So I really just loved it because I had the boss who hired me. He's still there. He's actually the CEO now. He had said, you seem like you have an analytical mind. And I said, yeah, I'm a combination of analytical and artistic. And he said, well, I have an opening as a marketing analyst. I'm going to give you a chance. And that opened my world up into learning about investments, about business. They paid for my MBA, which I did at night. And so that was I just was learning, through that role there.
Okay. Now, for our audiences that are earlier in career, they're going to be like, yeah. So you did a degree in something completely unrelated and just waltzed into a job in financial services. Was there a particular methodology you applied to searching for a role? Because that's one of the things that we hear most often. It's like, it used to be so much easier than. I think there's an element of truth to that as well, because I got a lot of jobs through connections in the past. Like my preclinical research job was my cousin worked for Elan Pharmaceuticals in Dublin, and she referred me over to HR, and they interviewed me, and I got the job. But I probably would have never got it without her help. And I think that does still happen, although I know in HR we try as best we can to reduce this type of nepotism. How did you go about getting the first role?
Well, I remember the first role, so it was actually Ann Beha Associates was on a job board. That was also a job application through BU.
Is this an actual board?
It was an actual physical
like
board.
With the things where you rip off
I think you had to leave it on there with the push pin, but I think I wrote it down. And then Gannett, Welch and Kotler probably was early days, maybe even a newspaper ad. But at times when it was different. It was a very different world where people were, I think whether the volume wasn't as high, but they checked, they wanted to see what schools you went to, who you knew. So that definitely, my references in the Boston area certainly helped for those jobs.
Okay. So how long were you there for?
So Gannett, Welch and Kotler was about 3 years. Yeah.
Okay. And what happened after that? Or was there, when you decided to leave there, why?
Well, I became a Klotz. So that's
okay.
No, that's where I met my future husband.
I was going to say, let's clarify. It sounded like Klotz for a second.
Yes, it does sound like that. Klotz.
No, I know a good few Klotzes. Yeah. Okay.
So
you became a Klotz. So enter Mr. Klotz.
Mr. Klotz was from Germany, who was best friends with our head of IT at Gannett, Welch and Kotler. And suddenly my world opened up. And I think I was always interested in international, very, intercultural aspects. And we just hit it off, and someone had to make the move. We were doing that long-distance relationship going back and forth between Boston, and he lived in a town, Lumpertime. So I eventually moved from my 14th floor apartment in Back Bay, Boston, to a town of less than 30,000 people outside of Heidelberg. Yes.
Okay, so you guys were doing long distance Germany to the U.S.
Yeah.
So he didn't live in the U.S.?
No, he was, living in Germany.
Wow, that is long distance. Okay, and was it not at all on the table? Like, metropolis of Boston and
no, it couldn't have been.
A lot of opportunities.
It was very different, and I was a little bit of a workaholic back then. I was running marathons. My world was all around Boston, or potentially New York was probably going to be my next move till he walked in my door. And so I had to reinvent myself. And I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons was going to a new country, learning the language, trying to figure out where do I work. And also my career was not as straightforward that was more difficult in Europe. With kind of the different directions I'd taken.
Yeah, well, we get a lot of hesitation around people relocating because they're, exactly as you said. I understand sometimes with family it can be quite difficult, but even people who are single, who don't have attachments, and you try to get them to move, and they just won't. And we know this from lots of recruitment. Why did you decide? Of course, I know love is important, and there's a reason why I came here as well.
Yeah.
But you've got a career track, and you're like, this is where I'm going to go, and you sound like you had a plan.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden, something happens, you kind of throw the whole thing out the window and see what happens in Germany.
Yeah.
I know you're going to say it was a good decision. But what advice would you give to people around when it's time to just kind of, okay, the plan is now out the window and I'm going to go and do something. I've got no idea how this is going to turn out. How did you go through that thought process?
There probably wasn't much of a thought process, but I would say looking back, and I would give the advice of it's this risk reward. What do you have to lose? I think it was, I had my degrees. I think some friends of mine and even one of my brothers had said, you have the degrees, you've done some work, why not? They can never take your degree away from you. You've proven yourself, you're early in your career. And I just thought, why not Germany? I actually thought originally that there would be a lot of similarities with the countries. They spoke English. But when I moved, I realized I needed to prove myself. I had to learn German. And I really needed to, I think, really first start networking and really pushing for myself, advocating for myself to get that first job when I relocated.
Okay, I really want to get into this now because we get a lot of trailing spouses in some cases who will come to us for advice. I work with an organization called Capacity that helps migrants to find jobs, highly skilled migrants. So people who've maybe worked in pharma in a different country and have now either through maybe no fault of their own have had to relocate. So in some cases they are refugees. How or what did you go through, first of all, to get that first role? And how did you start to integrate yourself? What was your, thought process? I'd really love to hear that.
So I first went and said, okay, Frankfurt was the nearest city. I had been working in financial
Heidelberg
service.
didn't
I
come
didn't
into
even
the mix.
know. I think that was too not good enough. So for me, Frankfurt was about an hour away. I knew it was, one of the financial capitals of Europe. And so I began looking for analyst roles. And then I believe I then was very targeted in my search. I was looking for, okay, who are kind of those search agencies? I was looking online, but I don't think this was back in the day when Monster was really... that was one of the early ones. But I then, sent my CV over, even mailed it to some of the agencies in Frankfurt, and then did follow up with those agencies who did then get me an interview, a very long interview process at Deutsche Bank as an analyst. I was very excited. I landed the job after, I think it was a 4-month interview process, only to be told during this waiting period for my start date that they had done a restructuring and a lot of the jobs were moving to London. So the job fell through. Ooh. And then I had to figure it out again.
Heartbreak.
It was.
I mean, it must have been, the elation of actually getting it. And then before you even get to start, it's taken away.
Yeah.
Did you ever want to kind of just give up and tell Mr. Klotz to go to work?
I mean, he was very supportive for me. I think he was also very supportive in making sure that, that I kept, with the German lessons. So I was taking German lessons every day, as much as I could, integrating myself while at the same time my job search was about a part-time job as well.
Yeah.
And that was really, I was very focused. And that's when we started to look at, okay, maybe there's something nearer, and just my networks. That's when I was really networking hard, and had networks into Roche Diagnostics, which was in Mannheim, even then also to another company that was out in Darmstadt. And I ended up working for the company in Darmstadt, a full-time job, but I had a 1-year-old baby, and it was very difficult. So it had, again, another pivot and move. But that was probably my first job. Was actually, I don't think I even put it on my CV because it was only a few months there.
Okay, and what does networking look like for you?
Network is just, someone who, whether this was, a neighbor or someone who knows a neighbor. I think at that time, the network into Roche Diagnostics was actually through my mother-in-law, who was in a walking group and just was saying, my daughter-in-law is looking for a job. She speaks English. She has a master's degree. And then she put me in touch with a woman who was running an internal coaching team at Roche Diagnostics in Mannheim. And that was really then coming back to pharmaceuticals. But again, it wasn't my dream job. My dream job would have been working in financial services in Frankfurt. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a huge power in the networking. And we talk about that a lot with people when they arrive here. It's just, okay, 5 people. Ask all 5 of them to just have a coffee with you, explain what you want to get to and how maybe they could help you. And also recognize that that's not maybe their number one priority. So you've also got to follow up with those people, because people often don't. They're like, oh, well, I met these people for coffee and nobody got back to me with a job. I'm like, yeah, but did you call them again?
Right,
And did you
right.
call them again? And did you
Right.
push them a little bit? I mean, you don't want to be unbearable in terms of just chasing people down consistently, but a little bit of follow through. And we often find that's where people fail, is that they give it that first go and then nothing happened. This market is terrible. The Swiss don't, help me, or, I hear that kind of stuff a lot. So you were mother-in-law's walking group, and then it always turns out to be completely the thing you didn't expect.
Right.
That ends up working out. So Roche Diagnostic, I saw you're a trainer.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, you were not a trainer before.
No, I had to learn. I think they just said, okay, we need people doing English speaking, English training first. So I thought, okay, I'd been an English major, art history double major in college. So I said, I can do this. So I really trained the trainer to be an English trainer. And then it started getting into, there was interest in intercultural aspects. So that was something I was bringing to I would do coaching with some of the marketing teams, some of the higher managers, and realizing they were having challenges when they would send people to the U.S. or the U.S. site. And hence I started giving intercultural training and learning, trying to find, course materials where I could train myself to do that. And so I started to, create a brand for myself, so to speak, within Roche Diagnostics of, okay, she's someone who has an international background herself, understands business, but it's also who can train us on those nuances, the differences, cultural similarities and differences.
Yeah, okay. Well, any examples? Any big examples for people out there going to the U.S.?
Well, it definitely, I think for, Roche, they had sent several senior executives to, I believe it was Indiana, or it was definitely out west. And that was very different. They said, well, people are, they're changing jobs so often, and there's processes that aren't written down. And so, it's trying to learn how to give best of both worlds. But that was really, some of their challenges were just, it was different. And, you think, okay, we're all speaking English, but there are those nuances.
Yeah. So in the U.S., they didn't have the processes written down. So the Germans were not happy.
Absolutely,
okay,
right.
well, that probably makes sense.
Right,
okay.
Right.
And how long were you at Roche Diagnostics for?
I think I was training for about 5 years. So both my children, at that time, I was working part-time as a trainer. My second child was born. And then my husband got the offer to go on assignment to the U.S. So I became essentially the trailing spouse back to my home country.
Okay, and where to?
New Jersey, so outside of Morristown.
Okay. All right, so everybody's up and moving again.
That's right.
And landing back in your home country, but in a different state, different city.
Yes.
So what'd you do then?
I said, all right, pharmaceutical, here we go.
Okay, but what made you decide? Oh, I'm in New Jersey, right?
Yeah.
That makes sense, but why then all in on pharma?
I think by then I realized that interest in the medical interest that I had in high school was serving me well. I was interested in, what you could do, for patients. And I don't want to sound, fake here, but this was something that I'd really learned at Roche and Genzyme, and saying there's something about this industry where I feel like you're making a difference as opposed to when I worked in financial services. So that purpose was there. And so I was very targeted. From my learnings of moving to a new country, networking, and also, okay, who are the agencies? Who do I need to reach out to? And I was methodical. I mean, and this is something I still do to this day, is just a methodical mapping of networking and reaching out to get that first job.
Okay. So what was it?
So then it was actually, and you will laugh, it was assistant to something at Grunenthal USA, which was a U.S. subsidiary. And they said, here we are. That Grunenthal had marketed their drugs, their products in the U.S. with J&J, with Johnson & Johnson, and they had a small clinical team. And they said, we're growing in size. We need someone to do HR and finance, but we think we need an assistant. And an assistant who can do some HR and some finance. And I said, that's fine. I think it was assistant business administrator, but doing a little HR and a little finance.
Okay. A lot of people, when they relocate or pivot, will say something to me like, and I often say getting a foot in is probably the most important thing. But they'll say, well, assistant. I used to be a trainer. I worked in financial services. I have a master's degree. I mean, I'm not going to be an assistant to somebody. Why did you take that job and not, say, hold out for a more senior role or something? Talk through the thinking there.
I think that's maybe where I realized that foot in the door is the most important. I think I'd already learned that from when I moved over to Germany. And I said, okay, there was something interesting, there. And I was just more interested, who's Grunenthal? What are they doing? They're a small company. Maybe I can get involved with different things. And the role had HR elements, it had finance elements. So I thought this could be interesting. And within 6 months, I was promoted. I just kept getting promoted. And I ended up staying at Grunenthal for 6 years. And that's really where I really got my bread and butter HR training.
Okay, so you were promoted pretty quickly.
Yes, I think it went from, I don't even remember the second one, but I was HR finance manager. Then at some point I was chief administrative officer. At one point I was interim CEO at the end before they brought in, there was a switch of CEOs. The CEOs were usually the German executives coming over. But yeah, I was really overseeing HR and finance and just kind of going up the ranks. It was a small subsidiary, but what was really interesting was we were tied into the global organization, which was based out of Aachen. Yep. And I was part of the HR leadership team working on really interesting HR projects. So I was learning about performance management, talent acquisition, while at the same time on a local level, figuring out how do you deal with severances. Someone needs COBRA or, someone's on a maternity leave.
What's COBRA?
Yeah, so this is, COBRA is, you don't have that in Switzerland. It's because it's
sounds dangerous.
It is. No, it's very key. It's health insurance protection.
Okay.
Exactly. Yep.
How many people were there?
Probably about 50, 55 people.
Okay, but you kind of went from the assistant to the interim CEO.
I think within 6 years at the end. Yeah.
Okay. That's pretty wild, though. I mean, and I think it really demonstrates the fact that if you can show up and just say, okay, I'll take whatever job you've got and I'll show you how good I can be, that it really kind of pays off. But a lot of people would say, oh, but I'm going to get stuck in that structure, or people are going to only see me as an assistant. Did you have that thought?
I don't think I didn't. I think I was just thankful. I think I've always been just thankful to get that first job, and it didn't matter to me what the title was, and I was learning. So, I remember we had an HR advisor who I had on speed dial learning this.
Yeah.
And so I was learning from her. The finance part was a little easier, although there was someone, in accounting who she actually reported to me, but I was learning from her. But to me, the title didn't matter really at the end. And I think that's what it was. It was just, let me see what I can learn. And then over time, I was making suggestions and growing. And that's how I really then, became promoted.
Okay. No, I think that's a really important lesson, because very often we have that issue where people say, okay, well, I'm going to learn a lot, or I'm going to get exposed to these amazing leaders, but that salary package is like 10% below what I earn today, and therefore I'm not interested. And I think that there's a lot to be said about, again, we usually never advise people to take less money. It's, we usually will say, okay, if you really want to make this move and you're in a comfortable job right now, normally we're taking people out of roles and they're looking for more. I do understand that. But one of the things we see is that the people don't necessarily look at the opportunity, especially early in career. Later on, they get it much more, because I think once you financially establish yourself a little bit, you're like, okay, I have money now and I'm fairly comfortable where I am. How can I develop? And I think that's really more the question to ask, as opposed to, is this the next level?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
But we know, because you're sitting here today, that obviously you left Grunenthal at one point. Was this again across the ocean at this stage, or did you stay in the U.S. still?
That was still the U.S. At that time, I thought, all right, I'm maxing out here at Grunenthal USA. I had a great relationship with headquarters, was actually close and still am close with the global CEO. He's no longer the CEO. But they said, well, we can offer you a job in Aachen. I said, I'm not coming back to Germany right now. And so what I was looking for, that was 6 years in, saying, okay, I love the pharma space, especially the biotech space, leading the HR function. And there I got a call from a biotech company that was spun out of an incubator in Chicago. They were actually they were reorganizing themselves with a new name, new leadership team. They had just hired a new CEO and new CSO, and asked me to come and head the HR function after they were reorganizing. And then they were going to move their headquarters to New Jersey. So then I took my first lead HR role for a privately held biotech.
Okay, so differences between the German multinational and the spun out biotech?
This was chaos. Chaos. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
It was exciting. I really learned, this was coming out of an incubator, out of it was the Institute of Technology in Chicago. So they had an asset in the biosimilar space. And they were trying to bring this was actually the biosimilar to Humira. So I said, this is neat.
That's a pretty good one. Yeah.
And I saw they had an amazing CEO was actually had done the original drug development for Humira. So I said, that's not too bad. Their CSO was also very well-established pharma out of AstraZeneca. And I said, let's see what this is all about, really kind of taking the lead to be leading the HR function.
Okay. And I mean, these were people you interfaced on pretty much a daily basis?
Yes. So
Okay.
so I reported to the CEO. And then it was also interesting because we were privately held. We were a portfolio company, and we were owned by the founders of Amneal, which is one of the largest generic companies. So I learned a lot in that role, also from working, with executives and also, with a board. That was really my first exposure to a kind of true board. The board before at Grunenthal was, the board within Grunenthal, but here it was, they were the owners, board owners here.
Okay. So what was I guess there was probably a lot of mistakes made in that period, not just by you, but by the company. When you're small and it's chaotic, people make mistakes. What would you say would have been the biggest one or biggest learning for you in that period of time?
That was a big learning. And it was really trying not to say I know what to do. I didn't know what to do. I tried to, this was really, people did not, the Chicago site had, this was they had a pilot scale manufacturing. They didn't trust the former leadership. So they had actually fired the CHRO the day I arrived. So they fired her and then introduced me at a town hall on that same day. The CEO and CSO had been there maybe a few weeks earlier, and then announced the departure of the head of HR. So this was really coming in where there was a distrust of management. There were a lot of processes that weren't in place or needed it. And then we were actually working on a massive, we were going to restructure and completely lay off that site and then redo and set up a new facility in New Jersey. So that was they told me when I joined, okay, we're going to lay off about 75% of the site, and you have to do, federal warn. These are all regulations, and then go and now set up a new site in New Jersey. So this is within my first 90 days.
So you relocated?
I commuted. I had an apartment. I was commuting Monday through Friday, had an apartment in Chicago, and would come home on the weekend.
But did you know that they were going to move it back to New Jersey?
I did.
So you had a couple of months of kind of going there.
Yeah.
And was that the first time you had to be responsible for something like that?
It was. And that's where I learned, okay, who are your partners? Who are your partners? You need to be, need the partners with the board. You need the partners with the leadership. And more importantly, a good lawyer. So I had very strong relationships from Grunenthal with external lawyers. These are the people who are going to support you in your role and being able to execute.
Any advice for somebody who's going to have to go through something like that? Because that's, it's common in HR, but not everybody's been responsible for basically letting go 75% of a site. That's
where you need to really, we say get your ducks in a row and step back. I think that's where I said, who do I need to help support me with this? I can't do it alone, and I don't have all the answers. And that was one of the big learnings, is you will not always have all the answers.
Yeah.
And then together, so it was together as a leadership team working on that restructure, together with the attorneys. We had attorneys in Chicago and in New Jersey to support with that process.
Okay. And I guess it must be around clarity, communication.
Absolutely.
For the people
as
well, to make it somehow humane as much as possible.
Right, exactly.
And this is an interesting one. So I hear this all the time from people, and there's whenever we have kind of a restructure coming up, and having been in HR or been in confidential calls or where they're going to let go a department and they need to replace it, or, a total restructure. I often hear the two different ways of doing it. In one case, people will say, okay, in 6 months, we're going to let half of you go, but we're not going to tell you which half just yet. Or it's, bam, you're informed on the day and basically you can walk out the door. Any input or thoughts or logic on how you would do it? Because both have their challenges.
They do. And I think it's somewhere in the middle. The restructurings in all my roles, we've had to do the restructuring. Since that, I would say that role was really probably the first one where I was actually leading, the restructuring. But I think it's, communication. So we had always communicated to the Chicago site, we're going to be building up new R&D. We're moving the headquarters. We will keep you informed as soon as possible. Now, mind you, this was within 36. These are my first 30 days to get that pitch out there.
Okay.
And so it's really being upfront and transparent as much as you can, but also getting people to realize that, we still have a job to do. And I think that's the most important thing is, getting people not to worry. That was the same thing when I joined Lonza. When I joined Lonza, it had already been informed that the chemical division would be spinning out. Yeah. And people knew there was going to be a restructuring, but we were able to keep people motivated. And even when we did eventually announce who was impacted, always making sure it was fair. So I think that it's this balance between being as transparent as you can be, and making sure managers are close to their people. I think that's one of the most important parts during these changes within an organization leading up to a restructuring.
Okay. So after the amnial, or how long were you there for, actually?
So that was that 2.5, about 2.5 years.
So it was cut down, build up.
Cut down, build up. We ended up not having to do we ended up not having to cut as many roles. We were actually able to move several roles over to New Jersey, which was a neat opportunity to then have some of those. It was our researchers moving to New Jersey. So we were actually able to offer several people roles to relocate. Then we ended up keeping that site and then very quickly building up within, I think it was about 90 days, 100 days, to then fully staff the new labs in New Jersey.
Okay. And you left that role ultimately for what reason?
Well, then at that point, we had almost overstayed our time in the U.S. So at this time, if anyone knows, typical expat assignments are typically about 6 years. We were all over the 6-year mark at that point, and we had always said we would go back for our children to finish high school in Germany. And when Adello, that was that biotech, we got bought by acquired by our sister, one of the sister companies in the portfolio. I said, this is now probably the time. We also need to get our daughter back to finish high school, her last few years in high school in Germany. So it was more of a personal at that point.
How were the kids about that, actually? Were they knew the plan as well? Or was it like restructuring where they just got...
Yeah, I think they forgot about the plan. They've always been, obviously going to Germany in the summer, and their grandmother would come over often. But I would say I would not advise moving kids. My daughter was a freshman in high school. She had just finished her freshman year. My son had just finished 6th grade. So moving them back to Germany where they spoke the language. And mind you, this is right before COVID hit. So it was, getting them reestablished in a new part of Germany. We had never lived there. We actually chose right over the border from Basel because of the pharmaceutical industry.
Right.
But that was a really, restructuring for the kids, which was, I think we underestimated. Yeah.
Yeah. So any lessons learned there that you'd want to get into?
I think that, anyone moving with kids, it's great when they're younger and even maybe middle school. But as they get towards later years, it's hard. It's a new system. And I think our kids were not prepared for that. I think it was just, and it also depends on the personality of the kids. I think my daughter was, she was the older one, very much interested in, okay, now I'm finally going to a German high school. So she couldn't wait. And her brother
Okay.
at that point was really well established into his sports, his team. His friend group. They were all in kind of daycare together. So they went from
Grew up
daycare
together.
to sixth
Okay,
grade. So they had quite an adjustment when we moved back to Germany.
And what sports was he playing?
Soccer.
Okay,
football.
so that's transferable at least. It
It
wasn't
was.
like,
Yeah.
American football
No,
or something,
exactly.
baseball or something like that.
Exactly.
Okay. So you moved back. Well, I mean, it's funny because we relocated when I was 8, and my parents told me on April Fool's Day, and then we left 2 weeks later. So it was like they did the whole we're going, and then we were gone. But at 8, I think, and 8 and 5 and 2, of course there were like adjustment issues, mostly for me because I was the older one. But I agree. I can't imagine finally kind of establishing yourself in high school and you're in puberty and and then all of a sudden, bang, you're going to go to a whole new country.
Yeah.
Okay. So did you come over with a role already?
I did not. But again, being that planner, I had this all in the plan. So 2018, I knew the clock was ticking that we needed to get back. And this was even before Adello was acquired by our sister company. And in the summer of 2018, I believe it was already scouting Germany. So I did a look and see trip that I financed on my own and mapped out Germany. Okay, what companies am I interested in? And began and had informal meetings. And actually in 2018, I also had Santhera was on my list. So I had found the talent acquisition partner. I had written to her, said, I'm going to be in the Basel region. When I was at Grunenthal, we had worked on a rare disease. We were considerations of a rare disease franchise. So I knew rare disease was my target or pharmaceutical. And so I was really targeting certain companies in 2018 already with a spreadsheet. And then I did my look and see trip, seeing who I could meet from, whether it was in Frankfurt or Dusseldorf or up in Aachen or down in Basel. I had targeted companies and people.
Okay, so you kind of then did analysis, and ultimately you guys relocated over the border, to,
yes.
I don't know.
Laura.
Yeah. Okay. And then you had kind of said, okay, Basel is the spot, and then I'm going to just really start my application process when I get there.
Absolutely. So we were fortunate that because the kids had German citizenship and their father, I was able to actually relocate without a job. So I moved with the kids first, their dad, and at this time I'd actually even had been remarried to a second German. So we actually had a double move. We had to find, 3 of us had to find, so it was my husband, German ex-husband, and myself all had to find jobs. And we literally I was mapping it out where my ex-husband, who works for Evonik, where they had sites and locations. So he said, okay, these are the cities. And I said, okay, these ones are good for pharma. This one's not. And I really liked the Basel region. So we landed so I moved the kids without a job, going to Laura, and did my job search from there.
Okay, that like the whole other layer of complexity, because instead of 4 of you, then there was 5 people relocating?
Yes,
Kind of?
that's
Okay,
right. That's
wow.
right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's really a testament to not just planning, but also compromise, I suppose.
It was not easy. So the first priority was the kids. So we were very excited to have them. They landed in a good gymnasium. Then COVID hit. I think actually before COVID, we got the kids situated, and I got the job with Lonza and began working at Lonza even before the 2 dads actually came over. So they were actually stuck in the U.S. They couldn't get over. They had to come in during a window in COVID to even come over. So I was holding the fort down, working and getting the kids acclimated.
Okay, but Lonza during COVID must have been just mental. I mean, well, we saw it as well because we supported Lonza through this time.
Yeah.
So were you hired for one job and then it turned into something else completely, or was it?
No, I was always hired to, I was a global HR business partner for one of the 2 business units at Lonza Specialty Ingredients. So Lonza had 2 divisions at the time, Lonza Specialty Ingredients and Lonza Pharma. And it had already been announced that the specialty ingredients would spin out. So I was aware this would be spinning out, but this is also spinning out during COVID. Yeah. And one of our largest manufacturing sites was actually Visp, where we were producing Moderna. So it was this interesting complexity of trying to keep workers during COVID. You're spinning out a company, you're coming up with a new brand, and they were also looking for, who's going to be our new owner. And so it was just all of these multiple layers when I took that job at Lonza.
Okay, and that became Arxada.
That's now Arxada,
Yeah, okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that was, again, another thing that I guess you hadn't done before. Had you spun out a company before?
No.
Okay, so you came on as a Lonza employee and then always
Yes.
knew that, okay, I'm going to ultimately aid the spin out of this
Correct.
business.
Correct.
In not knowing who's going to own it. Yeah, okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
you kind of just go for it, huh?
Well, I think for that one, I said it's Lonza. It's reputable in
Yeah, of
Switzerland. And for that role, at that time I'd been, an HR head of a biotech. And here this was a business partner role. And I said, I just want to get that foot in the door at a Swiss company. Lonza's reputable. And then what sealed the deal for me was I was reporting to a business unit head, Antje Gerber, and also then Mailet Manassian, who became the CHRO of Arxada. So two very strong leaders. And I said, this is, between learning from them and a spinoff and in Switzerland, there was enough there to make it interesting for me.
Okay. And then was it a case of, okay, it's in really good hands? And Santhera kind of came back on the radar at that stage?
It did. It was interesting. We got Arxada set up, had a great relationship, with the business, working with Antje and Mailet. Mailet became the CHRO, and here I was on this HR leadership team with business partners globally, all the way from Asia to the U.S., South America. But I was aching a little bit for that lead HR role. So I was really loving, the global aspect of it. And then I got the call from Santhera. And, I don't know who initiated it, if they remembered that I had talked to them. But here it was, lead HR role for a publicly traded company in the rare disease space. So that was really, things were starting to come into play there.
Ticking a lot of boxes.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sure that anybody listening to this who's working in Switzerland in pharma or biotech knows Santhera because it's been quite a roller coaster ride for the company from back. I used to visit them back in 2009, I think it was.
Okay, right. We
did the first work with them and I was at Michael Page at the time and we were recruiting for them. And even more recently, it's been a lot of, is it there? Is it not there? Is it approved? Is it not approved? And then, of course, now we know it's in a great place and has a great strategy. But what is it like coming into, because Adello, I think it was, was not a publicly traded company, and you're in a lead function there. And I know you have to follow Cobra and the other one, I forgot what it was, but there's certain things you've got to do regulation-wise as a company. Yeah. But then a traded company publicly is also subject to a lot more. What did you learn in an HR function that you didn't, or maybe you didn't have to do before? What's the main differences?
The main difference is really that, executive and board compensation. So everything I learned on the job from Grunenthal to Adello to also Lonza Arxada, I was able to some of those best practices and kind of the fine tunes of HR. But working for a publicly traded company where, shareholders are actually approving compensation, that information is public, also with a share plan, an equity share plan. So that was, when Dario Eklund, our CEO, hired me, he said, you tick off a lot of the boxes, but this is the part where you haven't had that exposure. But he took a chance on me, seeing, that I had shown, proven myself, and this was going to be my learning on the job. So that was really, those first few years was really a lot of learning on, being, a CHRO of a publicly traded company and learning that compensation part of that role.
So did you previously have to take compensation questions to a board in the past? Or was that just sort of, no, we're going to sign off on it, CEO says it's fine?
It was a combination. So at Grunenthal and Adello, we did, and I got very exposed to compensation structures at those roles and best practices. So I had a lot of the main mechanics there, and then having board approval. But this is now a whole nother level of, you have an annual report, which includes the compensation table, and then working with the nomination and compensation committee. That was new, really having a specific committee to talk about those compensation compensation decisions. So that was really a learning for me.
Okay, cool. Let's get into that a bit because, I don't claim to know everything about this, but there's a lot of people out there who really have no idea what it's like to work as a C-level executive in a publicly traded company. So how do you work together with the board and then ultimately an AGM with shareholders? Talk to us about the structure of how things get approved. Some of those things are obviously nomination of board in an AGM and then approval of certain budgets, these types of things. But maybe walk through the HR function and how it supports both the board and then ultimately shareholders.
Yeah. So there's definitely a calendar of topics that need to go through approvals. So it's, a calendar where there's certain approvals needed, flowing from everything from what are your merit increases? What are your bonus? What are your equity plans? Or what is even, how are we benchmarking, our executives? The pay compensation and philosophy. That was one of the first things that I did. Also at that time, we also had a U.S. organization. And so it's, looking at what are those, what is going to be our pay compensation philosophy as a broad organization, and then drilling it down specifically on those decisions with the nomination and compensation committee on all of the compensation aspects, salary, bonus, equity. And then also, but they're also very interested in what's the pulse of the organization. And I think that's where, the CHRO role plays a unique role in providing that information and insight.
Okay. And what is a compensation committee?
So the compensation committee is really looking to make sure that your compensation decisions are, best practices, that they align with regulations for us in Switzerland, and making sure those checks and balances are in place so that it's not that someone just saying, okay, we like this person, we're going to give them this high bonus. Because at the end of the day, it's really the shareholders at an annual general meeting who are approving the compensation budgets for fixed compensation or salaries and benefits, and also variable compensation, bonus, and equity programs. So that's the checks and balances through the committee.
Okay, and who are the committee? Is it members of the board, members of leadership? Who makes it up normally?
Yep. So the members of the compensation or nomination and compensation committee are the chairperson of the nomination and compensation committee, and then one or two of the board members. And then also joining our meetings is our CEO, Dario Eklund.
Okay. You've come into a lot of really difficult situations, I'd say. And HR isn't necessarily, I think it's changed a lot, but even when I was in in-house HR roles, my leaders would often talk about the issues of being called to the table.
Yeah.
It was sort of seen as like, okay, we'll decide this decision and then HR will implement, and we haven't taken any input. Have you seen that evolve since you've joined the HR function?
I have, and I think that's why I'm passionate about the function. I've seen it become really a seat at the table. I think we talked about when at some point mid-career for me, getting that seat at the table. And now we're part of those discussions. And I think that's so important because we're seen as, part of those discussions and providing that input. And, one of the advice I could really give is understand the business. So you may wear an HR hat, but you need to be thinking about what's best for the business and then translating it down. But being able to be part of those discussions has really, and being strategic, I think that's what's made the role very interesting for HR. And I think that's what's exciting. And I think people who, when I joined, that's why I didn't originally take that job at Gensum. I thought HR, talent, I thought it was actually back then even being called personnel. And it's really changed, in my career. Yeah.
Yeah. My first job in Michael Page, I thought that it was an HR job, and I didn't want to work in HR. But I realized only later, after rejecting the offer and then ultimately taking it later, is that it was very, very different from HR. Of course, we do recruitment, but it's very, very different than that. And then ultimately going into HR myself and having time as a BP made me realize that I actually like let's say, the sales or agency side of things a little bit better. But that's obviously just me. But it was funny because my first reaction was, no. But it's really fascinating. And only when I was in it, I realized that in this function, when there's usually no news, it's good. It's only when things are going pretty bad that you get to shine at that point when, things go wrong.
Right.
Is there anything that you do to, let's say, stay anonymous in a way? Or do you attempt to highlight the HR function, try to elevate it?
I think we try to be right there with the business. I think that's something, partnering it, almost not highlight. We when I came in, we rebranded HR to people and culture, and really positioning ourselves to be there during those discussions and really putting it out there. But I've also put the ownership. I think a lot of times, okay, you would always hear HR will go take care of it, or there's a performance issue. HR will, they'll take care of it. And we're really trying to make it that it's the business and empowering people. And I think that's also, even when it comes to topics like pay, that was one of the last things HR would hold on to is the secret. This is all the secret information on salaries. And that's moving away with pay transparency. And I think that's where now you can really see it's integrated. And I think that's where we bring the best benefit is kind of that integration of people with the business.
Okay. And I mean, how do you think, just to throw one out of left field here, but it's a topic we discuss quite a bit. How is HR or you guys or you in general just thinking about obviously the change of the workforce that's coming and AI and these types of things? What's your opinion on what kind of jobs do you think will be new? What kind of jobs do you think may disappear? Any thoughts on that?
I think a lot of roles that are very process oriented will become redundant. You've seen now in the news, I think was it Google and some of the larger organizations starting to integrate AI and HR as a function. So you see even an HR and AI technology role.
I didn't see that. No,
yeah,
okay.
so that just I think that was, if it was Google last week announced it. So this HR and AI is coming together. So I think the world of HR as we know it will be evolving. But I think it's really trying to see that strategic thinking those two steps ahead. So on one hand, being strategic of where's the business going and how can HR support that. But in addition, at the end of the day, it's all about people. And that can only be managed by people. And I think that's the other aspect where we'll really be still a very critical, playing a critical role.
Okay. And then Santhera itself, tell us a little bit about what Santhera does and who they serve.
Yeah. So we're focuses in the rare disease area. We just celebrated our 20-year anniversary last year, and as you said earlier, we've had the ups and downs in the Swiss biotech industry, but we were actually able to launch our product we now have a product in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which is interesting because actually one of our founders first originally was trying to get a product out on the market for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It affects young boys who eventually lose their mobility. And really, it's a crippling disease that usually results in a shorter lifespan. So our product that we've brought to the market actually does not cure the disease, but it lessens the side effects. And so this is where it's been great to see, we've launched in Germany. Now we just recently launched in UK. So when I joined, we were coming back we had been a commercial organization with the failure of one of the clinical programs. The company had to do 2 rounds of restructuring and was really down to a very minimal staff. But they had just in-licensed this product, vamorolone. And so they were really focused, okay, let's see if we can get this launched. And so when I joined, it was preparing for those applications to get the regulatory approvals in the US and in EMA and in the UK, which we did. And this was over a short period of time and we're just slowly rebuilding. And once we got those approvals, it was exciting to see. It's been a very small, lean organization. And I think we learned our lessons that we need to be prudent, and still as we launch through each country, just slowly adding that headcount. But I think that's Santhera's secret has been resiliency and the culture. I think when people talk about Santhera, that's also what I heard in 2018, they have this culture of they actually like each other. We like working with each other. How many people can say that? People are working very long, hard hours, but it's also purpose-driven because you're bringing a drug that will really improve the lives of these young boys and men who suffer from Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
Okay. And do you consider yourself the custodian of that culture?
Yes. I was going to say that's probably the one, hence why when I came in to change the name, it's really making sure that we continue to live our culture and our values and the people we hire. So that's an important part. So it's really when we're interviewing candidates, seeing, do they fit our culture? Are they going to make it? And just at the end of the day, people who like working together. And it's not about, like you said, the title. It's really about why we're here and doing that for these patients.
Okay, Sarah. Before we wrap up, we've got a tradition of the mentorship minute.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be a minute. It can be less or more. But what we're trying to do here is really get a lesson that you've learned in your career out to our broader audience. And this can be people who, like I said, students or people graduating soon or early in career who want to be the CHRO of a publicly traded biotech someday, because you have a job that a lot of people would love to have. And you've made it there. And so what advice would you give to those people who ultimately want to end up in your shoes one day?
It's not a straight path. And I think it's really learning, taking opportunities that may build your skill set. So really that, learning from others, watching around you, and that it may not be that direct trajectory to a CHRO role, maybe taking a sidestep role like I have done, but then learning through that. There's always those learnings. And then I think the other thing is just really who can you mentor with? I think for me, I've had some great mentors, whether they were my direct boss or people I've reached out to informally and said, hey, can you mentor me? And that served me very well.
Sarah, thank you very much for being here today.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, Maurice.
My pleasure. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Leadership Lab, where we dissect life science success stories. If you enjoyed that, please check us out and follow on Spotify under Leadership Lab. If you don't want to miss any episodes, be sure to follow Headcount on LinkedIn or subscribe to the Headcount YouTube channel. And as always, we thank Headcount for making this possible. If you don't want to miss out on any of the latest job opportunities in the life sciences industry, please check out the newest roles at headcount.ch.